All right, so first let's talk about criminal mens rea. Mens rea is a mental state. Not all mental states are sufficient to justify criminal liability. Um, Two that are an intent to commit some conduct that would qualify as a crime, or to recklessly engage in conduct. The next level of mens rea, kind of escalating down the ladder, would be negligence. Negligence is a mental state that's sufficient for civil liability. Someone can sue you and win damages in court, but not sufficient for criminal liability. The state would not have the authority to put you in jail merely because you're negligent. So we're talking about criminal liability here. Intentional means essentially you're intending whatever the negative outcome is, or you know that the outcome is reasonably likely. It's a reasonably foreseeable outcome of whatever it is you're doing. And in the context of deadly force self-defense, which is how I'll narrow things down for purposes of our discussion here today, you've shot someone. Well, that could be murder, right? An intentional killing of another human being. It could be self-defense homicide. Meaning it is a homicide. One person killed another, but it's not a crime because it was done in self-defense. But in either case, the shooting is intentional. Now, you might say, well, when I shoot in self-defense, I'm just trying to stop the threat. I'm not trying to actually kill the person. And that's the responsible perspective to have. In fact, if you're using deadly force in self-defense, whether or not that other person dies should be, to some degree, inconsequential to you, meaning it's not your purpose that they die. It's your purpose that they cease being a deadly force threat to you, your family, or whoever it is you're trying to protect. I would suggest ideally you would prefer they not die. But death is not the intended outcome in a self-defense shooting, but it is knowingly. In other words, you know that death is a reasonably foreseeable outcome of, shooting somebody twice in the chest with a firearm. So that would be intentional. Sufficient for criminal liability. You may seek to raise a legal defense, a justification or other legal defense to that intentional killing that would relieve you of legal liability. The other criminal mental state relevant to today's discussion is recklessness. So recklessness is not intending the negative outcome. So you don't want someone to be shot, for example, but you're knowingly creating the unjustified risk of a negative outcome. So you know the risks of that negative outcome exist if you engage in this conduct. You know the conduct is not otherwise justified, and you do it anyway, and the bad outcome results. In a use of force event, this could be involuntary manslaughter. So what would be a good example would be Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin's holding what he knows to be a real gun. He doesn't know there's ammo in it, but he doesn't bother checking. He knows it's a real gun capable of firing real ammo. He points it at Helena Hutchins. He cocks the hammer. He presses the trigger. And lo and behold, there is a live round in the gun. The gun fires that live round into Helena Hutchins and kills her. Now, Alec Baldwin did not intend to shoot and kill Helena Hutchins, but he engaged in conduct that he knows any reasonable person would know creates an unjustified risk of death to another, that is, pointing a real gun at another person, cocking the hammer, pressing the trigger, without ensuring there's no live ammo in the gun, as he obviously didn't. That's reckless conduct. That's involuntary manslaughter in the context of Helena Hutchins. A more classic example might be drunk driving. So someone's at a bar, they get drunk, they get behind the wheel to drive home. They're not intending to run anybody over and kill them. They don't want to hurt anybody. They just want to get home, go to sleep, pass out, whatever. But they know that getting behind the wheel drunk creates an unjustified risk of that negative outcome of killing someone, driving on the way home intoxicated, and then they actually hit someone in the crosswalk and kill them. They didn't intend to kill anybody, so it's not a murder, but it's reckless conduct. It's the unjustified creation of a risk of death, ignoring that risk, and then death results. You've committed a drunk driving homicide, sufficient for criminal liability. So that's intentional mens rea versus reckless mens rea. Now, to either of these mental states, there are legal defenses or arguments that could be made. In the context of an intentional use of force against someone, what we classically think of as self-defense, you've shot someone who's coming at you with a machete. The legal defense you would typically raise would be one of self-defense. Self-defense is a legal defense um, that consists of up to 5 elements. They're listed here in the slide: innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. So that's a legal defense you can raise to an intentional killing. What if you're charged with a reckless killing? Well, you can also raise the legal defense of self-defense to a reckless killing. Remember, this is a killing you did not intend to have happen. You did not intend to cause death or serious bodily injury, to use force against this person. This was reckless, unintentional. You can also raise the legal defense of self-defense to a charge based on recklessness, but it works in a different way than it does when self-defense is raised as a legal defense to an intentional use of force. So implicit in the legal defense of self-defense to an intentional use of force is a negative element. The negative element's not typically included in the self-defense statute, although sometimes it is. But that negative element is that all these things might be true. In other words, you don't qualify for one of these required elements of self-defense. Or let me put it another way. You've intentionally shot another person, but you're saying you did it in self-defense. If you do that, then the prosecution has to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. So self-defense as a legal defense to an intentional use of force effectively becomes a negative element of the crime. So the state has to effectively attack one or more of these 5 elements in order to prove that it was not self-defense. So in a classic self-defense scenario, someone comes at you with a knife and you've shot them intentionally to stop that threat. Importantly, you're not saying it wasn't you. You're not saying, I didn't shoot that person, I have an alibi. You're saying, I shot that person, I did it on purpose, and they died as a result. But I committed that shooting in lawful self-defense. So this makes self-defense a defense of what we call confession and avoidance. I just realized I don't like the way some of these slides came up. It's going to cause more confusion than anything. Let me adjust this. Whoops. So classic self-defense to an intentional shooting is a defense of confession and avoidance. Okay. As always, folks, nothing but the highest production value. Now let me bring this back in. Importing my slides again. Okay, let's try this. So it's a defense of confession and avoidance, which means that you're not denying that it was you who fired the shot. You're doing the opposite of that. You're saying it was me who fired the shot. I did it intentionally. I shot that guy in the chest on purpose, which would normally, and he died as a result, which would normally be, say, a murder. But you're seeking to avoid legal liability by claiming the conduct was in lawful self-defense. So that's not what I wanted. There we go. Confession and avoidance to a charge based on an intentional use of force. So the prosecution is saying you committed murder. You shot that guy and killed him. And you did it intentionally. It wasn't a reckless act. Your defense there is, yes, I shot that person. I confess not to the crime, but to the underlying conduct. I shot that, just like the prosecutor says. I shot that guy in the chest on purpose and he died as a result. Not denying any of that. But I'm doing the opposite of that. I'm conceding. I'm confessing to that underlying conduct. But I'm claiming that I did that with the legal justification of self-defense, that I have these 5 elements of self-defense in my favor, and the state is unable to disprove any of those required elements beyond a reasonable doubt. If that argument is successful, then you have 0 legal liability for what you concede was an intentional killing of another human being. Confession and avoidance. So you're conceding to all the elements of the criminal charge, and you're seeking to avoid criminal liability because you're saying, even though that's all true, I should nevertheless not have legal liability because I qualify for the legal justification of self-defense. When we're talking about a crime based on recklessness, however, it's not an intentional killing. Remember, it's more like the drunk driving scenario. And there, what the prosecutor is saying is, listen, he didn't intend to shoot this person. We don't believe that this defendant intended to shoot this person. So it wasn't intentional self-defense. And therefore, we don't have to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. Self-defense does not become a negative element of the criminal charge because it wasn't an intentional act. We're saying it was a reckless act. So although he didn't intend to shoot the person, he was conducting himself in such a way that he knew he was creating an unjustified risk of shooting that person unintentionally. And then the negative outcome happened. The person was shot and died as a result. You can still raise the legal defense of self-defense there, but it works in a different way. It's not a negative element of the criminal charge that the state has to disprove beyond a reasonable doubt, because you're not really conceding to intentionally shooting that person, at least not according to the prosecution. It was not intentional. It was reckless.